It's a couple of days after the end of COP27, and you probably remember that the Canadian government announced at COP27 a number of new initiatives, tighter regulations to lower the amount of methane that's emitted from the oil and gas industry. Now, why is that important? Well, methane is 84 times as potent a greenhouse gas as CO2 in the first 20 years. So, if you were looking for some way to cut emissions and have an impact in the short term, minimizing methane emissions would do it. And the oil and gas industry creates more than any other industry. So I'm going to talk to Tom Green, who is the Senior Climate Policy Advisor for David Suzuki Foundation, about some video footage they shot at about 128 wells in Western Canada that showed just how bad the problem is. So welcome to the interview, Tom.
Thanks, Markham. Good to be back.
Now, this is crazy. We've been talking about this for a long, long time. And one of the problems with getting a handle on just how bad the problem is up until recently, with the introduction of, remote sensing and some methane sniffing satellites and stuff, up until, the data was awful and then inaccurate.
The data remains awful. There was just a paper published in the last couple of weeks by Scott Seymour from Environmental Defense Fund, showing that the data in the inventory from the oil and gas industry is really not related to anything that one can go out and measure. It's very much based on these calculations, ground up calculations, like how many pieces of this are there, what's the leak factor for that, and so on, rather than going out there and actually measuring things. So we don't really have a very good sense of the emissions out there. We've been pushing the federal government to improve the inventory and make it more measurement based. And I think they're going down that path, which is really good news. But every time scientists go out there and measure things, they find often about twice or more than the methane that's being recorded in the inventory.
Right. And there's an explanation for that. It's very commonsensical. In 2015, in fact, it might have been anyway, one of the American environmental groups did a study on the Barnett Shale, which is in northern Texas. And what they did is they went out and they measured on the ground. And they found that 50% of the methane emissions came from really simple things like, broken valves and vents that got left open and, stuff that could be fixed with routine maintenance. So if you're doing a model and you're modeling things like, well, how much does this piece of equipment leak and how much does that piece of equipment leak? You can't model broken valves. It's kind of a random thing. And so we've only just been able to go out and do large scale measurements of any accuracy. And I guess the inventory just hasn't caught up yet, has it?
Well, it's definitely partly that, but there's another aspect to it. Like the videos that we had, Tim Doughty from TCHD, he works from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and he came up to Alberta and Saskatchewan, went to all these sites and just found emissions all over the place. But a lot of those the majority were not necessarily broken pieces of equipment. It's equipment that is designed to vent. Right. Or in some cases, it was a flare that was not combusting properly or not even lit. So then you have, just venting straight into the atmosphere. So it's a combination of not understanding or, how often something might be broken, but a lot more of it is just the fact the equipment's actually designed to vent, and the emission factors that we may have been using were just not that accurate. And in a couple of cases, more recent research, for instance, some done in BC, with the industry, government and NGO collaboration, the Merck project there, found that a lot of it was through the actual compressors where the actual engines were leaking methane. So a lot of methane slip. So that had been underestimated.
Sure. Well, let's talk about what can be done. And so it wasn't that long ago, 2015, that we were talking about a 45% reduction in methane emissions by 2030. And then the federal government upped that to 75%. But it seems to me, Tom, that, this is this is one of the easiest problems to fix, because a lot of it is equipment that needs to be, better, or it needs to be fixed, or it needs to be monitored, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
And every cubic foot of gas of methane that is prevented from leaking is actually a cubic foot that the industry can sell. And
Yeah.
the industry has some motivation here to get this right, and for some reason hasn't, just doesn't care or whatever. But so why doesn't the industry? Why don't we shoot for 100% by 2030? If we wanted to, we have climate targets, and I don't understand why we keep under at, we're not ambitious enough. And
Mhm.
this is an area where if we were ever going to be ambitious, this would be the easy one, the low-hanging fruit.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. In terms of low-hanging fruit, this one's actually, it's not just low-hanging fruit. It's already packed up in the grocery store in crates, ready to go
Yeah.
home. Like it's such a clear one. The International Energy Agency estimated that 70% of oil and gas emissions, methane emissions in Canada, could be cleaned up at no cost
Yeah,
because
that's a
because
crazy
you get to
number.
sell it. Like it's such a no-brainer. And to their credit, I think there's a few of the operators out there who have started to figure that out and are just working through and seeking to eliminate methane emissions. There's also some regions like in Alberta and Saskatchewan that are oil producing regions where that's what the well's there for. It's for the oil. It's not there for the gas. And so there's not necessarily gas infrastructure to tie into that easily. But the way it's been set up is industry's been given like let off the hook when in fact the thing to do is make that investment to a gas gathering line and then make sure that product is sold.
Yeah,
So
let's make it clear here. I've reported on this story many times before, and so
mhm,
BC, which is mostly gas production, there's not a lot of what they call associated gas, where as you mentioned, you're producing oil and you happen to get gas off with it, and you don't have
mhm,
the pipeline capacity to take it to market, so you just vent it. But BC has stronger regulations. It's mostly dry gas only, and their leak rate is estimated to be fairly low. And we should point out that in the Montney, the northeast part of the province, a lot of that is electrified. The production is electrified, and that
mhm,
and that helps a lot. So that's okay. And then Saskatchewan is the worst. Saskatchewan is. I remember the numbers from in a Canadian Energy Research Institute study from 2018, and Saskatchewan was just like off the charts, even though they have a small amount of production.
mhm.
And the government claims that it's already brought that down by 40 or 45%.
Yeah,
Now,
the government does like to claim that it's a leader in the methane space.
right.
Um, and that's one reason we hired Tim Doughty to go out there, and because we wanted the public to be able to see. It's an invisible gas, so you can't see it. You drive by a site, you think it's working fine, and like it's such a potent greenhouse gas, low hanging fruit, like you say. So we wanted to make sure Canadians understood that industry may be saying and government may be saying that it's addressing the problem, but to date, I mean, you shouldn't be going by and like we thought Tim would maybe come back with about 20 videos, and he came back with 128 of them. And, we're just seeing a small selection behind me there, but
Right.
there's just so much to choose from. And he's done this for many years and was quite surprised by the level of emissions he saw and just lack of best practices. So, I mean, we're very, very pleased that the federal government has put out its proposed framework for methane, um,
Right.
which which would really tighten things up a lot. And we think, we're very hopeful it'll get well beyond 75%, which is where we got to go. We got to go to virtual elimination. Like there's no.
Sure. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is Alberta, because BC produces 5 billion cubic feet of methane, of natural gas or methane, every day. Alberta produces 10 billion cubic feet, and Saskatchewan 400 million. So Alberta is the big one. Its gas industry has been around a lot longer, and so there's all kinds of old leaky equipment,
Mm,
and And frankly, there's an argument to be made, and the industry and the regulator push back on this, but the argument has been made that the Alberta Energy Regulator has basically been captured for decades and has winked and just has been lax in enforcement, hasn't done anything about it, still isn't all that interested in doing much about it. And so even if the federal government comes in, I mean, they can prod, but the province has to be on side on this.
Well, it would be very helpful if the province was on side, and it's really regrettable that the province doesn't show any leadership on this issue. And indeed, I think you're quite right that, I mean, one of the issues is that there's not independent monitoring and enforcement by the provinces, which needs to be the case. One thing that shifted, though, is that the NGO community and also the academic community, and the fact that we now have methane satellites, like our ability to detect and to hold the powers that be to account for failures to address methane and to embarrass until we get action. That's improved markedly. And also, like, there's so much happening in that space in terms of skilled workers in BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan who can actually go out there and help industry fix this problem and recover this gas. So the conditions are right to really push hard in this case, especially
agreed. And we have, and the industry has to be pushed harder. And hopefully this interview will add just a smidgen more embarrassment, and get them to act. So Tom, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, really great to talk methane, Markham, anytime.